Well, hi, good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome. And my name is Dr. Nicola Ducharme. I'll introduce myself a little bit more in a minute, but I've been on the Great Plains email list for quite a while, and I just find it such a friendly and supportive environment. And so when a few questions came up lately about Lyme testing, and I've been emailing with a few members of that list, I thought, well, it might be a good chance just to pop on and do a webinar and try and share some of the knowledge that I have gained over the, almost 20 years I've been treating Lyme. I've been in practice since September 2003. So it's my 20-year anniversary this September of being in practice. And when I first got into practice, I was super fortunate. I worked with Dr. Kurt Wooler, who many of you know. And I went into biohealth centers, which was biohealth centers back then, before Dr. Wooler converted it back to Still Point Integrative Medicine, which was his practice. So he and I worked together, and he mentored me and taught me everything about autism. And I worked with autism exclusively for a couple of years and did some Great Plains outreaches to different cities around the US. And it was wonderful and awesome. And then I started seeing some of the moms of these kids that we were working with, and they were coming in and they were like, oh my God, everything hurts. I'm exhausted. I can't think straight. I thought it was just having a young child and a special needs child, but this is like out of control. And so I started doing like functional medicine workup, adrenals, thyroid, heavy metals. I didn't know much about mold back then, but I knew to test for Lyme, and I was finding it coming up positive like more often than I had expected. And so there began the sort of segue into treating chronic Lyme disease. And that's pretty much what I do now. And obviously with a much bigger emphasis on the mold piece too. So that's what I want to share a little bit with you this evening. So with that being said, let me share my screen. This is always the tricky part. I'm not really techie, so I'm always like, is this going to work? I wonder. Okay. So welcome to this webinar on Lyme disease testing and interpretation. So for those of you that don't know me, I said my name is Dr. Nicola Ducharme. I'm a Lyme literate naturopathic doctor. So my practice is Restore Medicine. It's in San Diego, California, although I do work with patients all over the place, including Europe and Australia, acting more as a consultant in those cases. I have authored The Lyme Diet, was my first book. The Beginner's Guide to Lyme Disease in Australia, and Lyme Brain. And I have also created Lyme Ed for Patients, which is an online course, Lyme Ed for Practitioners, also an online course, and have also partnered with Beyond Protocols to create the Lyme Academy. So we're really like delving into practitioner training and mentorship. And I'll tell you a tiny bit about those later, but I won't take much of your time with that. So what we're going to talk about tonight is looking at which tests to run, and even before that, which labs to use. And I'm going to give you my opinion on what's the best, pros and cons of a couple of big labs that are being used right now, and then also just strategies to optimize results. So just to give you a lay of the land, I will, this PowerPoint slideshow will probably take about 45 minutes. And then I do have some labs pulled up for you that we can have a look at and go through, and I'll sort of give you like my interpretation. And so we'll probably do that for 20 or 30 minutes. And then if there's Q&A at the end, we can certainly do Q&A. Feel free to pop questions in the chat or the Q&A along the way. I will try and glance at that. And if it's sort of clarifying for what we're talking about in the moment, then I will certainly address it. And if it's sort of a conversation of its own, then we will hold it until the end. So with that, let's jump in. So looking at which tests to run. So lab testing for Lyme is notoriously problematic. It's just, there's no Lyme test that's 100% sensitive and specific and 100% ideal. But the lack of sensitivity in basic testing for Lyme is a big part of the reason for the misdiagnosis of Lyme. So if somebody went to their regular GP or primary care doc and said, I want a Lyme test, if they didn't get laughed or shouted out of the office, the doctor, what they would probably run is an ELISA test through one of the big commercial labs, your LabCorp or Quest, something like that. The problem is the ELISA test is not a sensitive test. Okay, and so what I have found over the years is having that ELISA test is actually often a disservice to the patients, because then if they get a false negative, which often happens, that could potentially prevent them getting a Lyme diagnosis, getting any further testing or any treatment. So I've had patients in my practice who are like, oh yeah, I was tested for Lyme 10 years ago, it was negative. And so 10 years ago, they made a decision that they didn't have Lyme, or they were told by their doctor they didn't have Lyme. And another 10 years went by where they didn't pursue treatment because they just assumed that that test was correct and it said negative, therefore it was negative. And I can't tell you how many people have come back, years later and said, oh God, it really sounds like I have Lyme. Like this is really a match with my symptoms. And then they follow up and they learn that those standard tests may not be adequate. And then they get more specialized testing, and lo and behold, they have Lyme and co-infections. So having the negative on an ELISA test does not mean there's no Lyme. That's the first thing to be aware of. And so unless, if the only way a patient can afford any Lyme testing is to get an ELISA and a Western blot done through those big labs, then fine, we'll do it. But if they get a positive, it's actually more lucky than anything that it got caught, because there's so many false negatives. The other thing that really breaks my heart is I've had numerous patients who've said, oh yeah, I had a Lyme test back in the day, but it was positive, but the doctor told me it was a false positive and I don't have Lyme. And that has happened more times than I care to report. And so for any of you that are in the Lyme space, you may have gathered by now, it's a very politicized kind of illness, weirdly so. And so there's just this like real denial. So if you have a negative test, you don't have Lyme. If you have a positive test, it's a false positive, you don't have Lyme, right? So we have to use more sensitive testing and more specialized testing. So I'll talk to you tonight primarily about two main labs, because there's a newer one in town, which is Vibrant Wellness, which I know a lot of you know and probably use. I'm a little concerned about their Lyme testing, and I'll tell you why, but I will look at the pros and cons of each. But in my view, IGeneX is still the gold standard. It's still my go-to, and I do use their testing where possible. So given that two of the bigger labs I'm seeing now are Vibrant and IGeneX, I'm going to mostly go into detail on each of those. Caveat that I have no affiliation with either lab, and that everything I'm saying is really my opinion based on my experience working, as a Lyme literate naturopath. There's not an absolute right or wrong. It's one of those things, but I'll try and kind of give you a balanced view, and we'll look at some of the reports so you can see what I'm talking about. There are some other labs that are in the Lyme testing space. One that was actually somebody reminded me of earlier in a training call was MDL, or Medical Diagnostics Lab. I think they're used more by East Coast docs because they are an East Coast based lab. I had not heard anything about them in years. When I contacted them several years ago, they would not let me set up an account. So I didn't get to use their testing. So I didn't get to fall in love with them, or not. But they are still in existence and they do offer Lyme testing. The reports I have seen that I've sought out, they're not nearly as detailed as the IGeneX, but working from home. But they are around, and so we just we have to recognize them. DNA Connections offers a urine PCR test. That was popular a few years ago when they first came out, because the good thing about that was the sample collection was super easy and it was a reasonable cost. I mean, still a few $100s, but cheaper than the IGeneX. However, as time went on, I was really aware of sort of a lack of sensitivity of their test. And the other thing I found was many reports were like IND indeterminate, or NPS, which meant non-predictive size. So their sort of description, and I'm paraphrasing, but their prescription of non-predictive size is sort of like, yeah, we saw some evidence of the bug, but not really as much as we would expect to see for a positive result. And I was like, okay. And I was just seeing the same results coming time after time after time. And there were some clear evidence that there was co-infections being missed and whatever. So DNA Connections is still around. I actually had to look up their website to make sure they're still around. They very much are. And they still offer that urine PCR test. IGeneX has since then offered a urine PCR test as well, and actually came in a couple of $100 cheaper than DNA Connections. I don't tend to order it. I do blood testing for reasons that I'll explain a little bit more. Galaxy Labs is another lab that does Lyme testing. I always thought of them as kind of a little bit more Bartonella specialized. I don't feel the need to use them for Bartonella testing, although I have over the years here and there. And IGeneX has improved its Bartonella testing. So it's made its Bartonella testing more sensitive. So I'm feeling like much more confident in that. The other thing about Galaxy is they only tested IgG antibodies for Bartonella, Quintana, and Henseley, not IgM. That test was just not available, which was kind of limited. And then the other thing I would say is very rarely did someone come back negative on those 2 IgG markers. And so, while we don't want false negatives and we want sensitive testing, if a test comes back positive like time and time again, that worries me a little bit as well. Almond Labs in Germany, I think, has good testing. It's a little bit less practical for us here in the US. I like what they're doing. But, given that we have access to IGeneX and other labs stateside, I tend not to send out to Germany. I know a bunch of Australian patients and Europeans do use Almond Labs, and I do like that lab. All right, so let's talk first about Vibrant Wellness. So Vibrant's grown rapidly into sort of many areas of sort of more integrative testing areas, including tick-borne infections, environmental toxins, mycotoxins, heavy metal testing, hormone testing, a slew of different gut health tests, food sensitivities, gluten intolerance, all the things. And so I'm sure that many of you are using Vibrant. And by no means am I like trashing Vibrant or saying that their testing is no good. I'm saying I have concerns about how they report on their tick-borne panel. But that doesn't mean I'm saying they're a bad lab or that they have nothing to offer. Indeed, I think they have a lot to offer. I just felt like they were just trying to be everything to everyone, which one thing I learned as a naturopathic doctor back in the day is don't try to be everything to everyone. Like really be good at what you do, like specialize and be good at what you do. So again, I sort of fall back on IGeneX because they really are a specialty Lyme lab, whereas Vibrant's tick-borne panel is like part of many, many things that they offer. So we'll look at their interpretation of results, and I'll share my views on that a little bit later. Now, in the Vibrant panels, they do test for a lot of different strains. So in their 1.0, tick-borne 1.0, these are all the strains of Borrelia they look at. On the left, you'll see the IgG and IgM antibody tests, what they test for. And the right-hand column is what they test for on PCR testing. I will say, and just to clarify, I'm sure you guys all know this, to clarify, so IgG and IgM is considered like indirect tests. So that would be your IFA, your immunoblot screen, the Western blots. The immunoblots are a sort of slightly more sophisticated version of the Western blot, and we'll talk more about that when we're talking about IGeneX. Whereas PCR testing is direct testing. They're looking for actual evidence of the bug. They're looking for DNA of the bacteria. And so it's nice to have a combination of different kinds of tests. I will say I've never so far seen a positive PCR on the Vibrant tick-borne panel. But very, very rarely did I ever see it on IGeneX too. I just think, when people are being chronically unwell, we don't have like gobs of bacteria just floating around in their bloodstream waiting to be caught, right? It's like buried into the tissues. It's deeper in the body than that. So looking at antibody testing is typically more useful, with the caveat that, Lyme is inherently immune suppressive. So it's like the irony that we're measuring an immune response to a bacteria that's suppressing immune response. But there it is. We've got to look for it somehow. So, but generally the antibody testing is more fruitful. The Vibrant panel, the PCR is rolled into the panel, so you're not paying any more for the PCR. The IGeneX panel, you are paying more for it. So as I will share with you, I typically don't order the panels through IGeneX that have the PCR testing included. So we'll get to that later. So co-infections in the Vibrant panel, the 1.0, so the Babesia, Bartonella, Anaplasma ehrlichia, they also do some of those in the PCR as well. In the tick-borne panel 2.0, so you get all of the above plus the following co-infections. So it's just a little bit of a wider net there. So sorry, I'm just making sure this is on. And then the tick-borne O plus opportunistic infections, you get all of the above, plus, you know, the viruses, strep, things like that. I typically find that most people who have decent insurance coverage will be able to get those done through the LabCorps and Quest, and I think those bigger labs do an adequate job of the viruses. But it is nice if someone's having a blood draw and it's not adding too much in cost just to get everything done in one place. So at this particular time, this is recorded, where are we, April 2023. The costs as per Vibrant website last week, the tick-borne disease 1.0 was $480, the 2.0 was $798, and the 2.0 plus opportunistic infections was $1199. So we will compare that with IGeneX costs. They are relatively less expensive than other panels, and do cover a large number of pathogens and antigens and species. So that is an advantage. Their testing can be done either through a blood draw or through a dried blood spot. However, not the PCR test. The PCR test can only be run with a regular blood draw. But like I said, that's okay, because PCR is not where we're typically finding the majority of our information. So here's where I get a little bit off with the Vibrant panel. So in Vibrant's interpretation, less than 10 is negative or low, 10 to 20 is borderline or moderate, and above 20 is positive or high. So in their Western blot interpretation, Vibrant counts the moderate markers towards the total result. So even though it's what they consider borderline, or what Vibrant has communicated with me, like indeterminate, they still count towards the overall positive result. And I'll show you that in a second. IGeneX, the marker has to be positive to contribute to the final result. So say if IGeneX needs 2 bands positive on the IgM Western blot, then if one of those bands is indeterminate or moderate or borderline or whatever, it's not going to count towards that positive result. That's going to show as negative, right? So this is where I just get a little bit like, with Vibrant, everything counts towards a positive result, even if it's not genuinely a positive value of being above 20. So this is their criteria. And I mean, don't feel like you have to remember this. And you could sit down with a Vibrant report and sit down with this and be like, okay, like connecting the dots. I wanted to ask my Vibrant rep for this information, just so I was clear on how they come up with their interpretations, because it's not quite as clear cut as on the IGeneX reports. And they actually don't provide this information on their reports, I don't think. I may be wrong, but I don't think, because I remember looking for it and having to go to my rep. So IgM is positive if VLSE1 or the C6 peptide or the WCS, the whole cell sonicate, is borderline or positive, and you have 2 bands of the following: 23 to 35, 31, 34, 39, 83 to 93. The IgG is positive if VLSE1 or C6 peptide is positive, and you have 2 positive bands of 18, 23 to 25, 28, 30, 31, 34, 39, 41, 45, 58, 66, 83 to 93. So in their IgG, they also look at and consider bands that other labs do not include in their criteria, right? And we'll see that again with IGeneX, that some of these bands here that would count to the Vibrant positive would not count to an IGeneX positive. They just don't recognize those bands as being clinically significant. So I'll show you the following result. You can see that on the IgG, there's no actual like positive markers. They're all moderate and indeterminate, and yet the overall lab result is positive. So if you have a look at this, and I know it's a bit squished the wrong way, but sorry about that, but you can get the gist. So the left-hand column is the IgG. So you can see they've got a 12.8, a 15, and a 12.8 again. And so they're all moderates, and yet their overall result is positive. Okay, so in my view, looking at that, if you've got three values that are like moderate or indeterminate, then the result should be indeterminate, but the result's positive. So that's kind of where I'm coming from there. Now, in this particular case, there was, you know, the C6 peptide on the IgM was high, plus they had a couple of other markers on the IgM. So, you know, you have to always correlate this information with the clinical presentation of the patient. And there's enough markers on here that I go, yeah, no, it probably is Lyme. But hopefully you can at least see my point of like, there's no red on the left-hand side, yet we have a red result. So I know what they're saying. And when I asked Vibrant about this, like I asked for clarification, and they were like, well, how they worded it, I'm really paraphrasing, but it was something along the lines of, we want everyone to have the opportunity to get a positive diagnosis. Like it was something like that. And I was like, oh, okay, like I get it. Lyme is like, it's missed a lot, and we want people to get an accurate diagnosis, but it's got to be an accurate diagnosis. It can't just be an everybody gets a prize diagnosis, right? So anyway, I feel like Vibrant results have a lot of interpretation that needs to happen. And I feel comfortable wading through that and assessing and correlating it with the patient. And I have some other tricks and tools that I use, but what concerns me is if practitioners who don't really know anything about Lyme are ordering Vibrant because it seems like really affordable and that's what everyone's doing these days, and then saying, oh, look, you're positive, without really understanding how to read the test, and especially the co-infection test, then I don't know, I just have a little bit of concern. So a lot has to come back to the patient and the clinical presentation. Their testing is, their reporting is just not as clear as IGeneX in my view. And I'm just scared that leads to more confusion in an already confusing space that is chronic Lyme and chronic Lyme testing. I will say also their reports are super long. So, you know, if you do like the tick-borne 2.0 or the 2.0 and opportunistic infections, if you've got the patient in front of you sitting at your desk and they're like, oh, can you just print my labs out for me? Then you'll be there for a good while and using a fair amount of ink. So make sure to stay digital with the reports. All right, so one thing I will say though is we do use Vibrant labs for SOT therapy. SOT is supportive oligonucleotide therapy. It is a therapy, a sort of newer therapy used for Lyme and co-infections. It's been used in cancer treatment for quite a while. So with SOT therapy, there's a requirement. It's the requirement of the lab in Europe that actually makes the SOT remedies. The patient must have a positive lab result within 6 months of doing the SOT. So in that case, and we want it to be all positive, and the lab in Europe does count the moderates as positive because they just adhere by Vibrant criteria. So in that case, their testing can be really ideal. And SOT therapy is also specific to a particular strain of the pathogen. So given that Vibrant is so specific for strains and tests so many different strains, then that can be advantageous as well. And like I said, the lab that creates the SOT accepts an indeterminate number as a positive result. So we use that in our favor. So for SOT, it's great. So my bigger concern, as I said, is, you know, the interpretation and whether it's sort of like finding everyone positive for Lyme and co-infections, even if there's only one moderate antibody found. Because in the co-infection testing, they report the antibodies, but they don't actually report it as positive or negative. They just give the number, and then we figure it out as practitioners. So if one person had a single antibody for, say, Babesia, for example, they've got one IgG antibody at a level 12. Does that mean they have Babesia? Well, we don't really know. It doesn't really tell us, right? So it's really up to interpretation and discretion. So here's an example, like they give a summary panel on one of the first pages. So here's an example, and I'll show you more at the end when we get to that part. But, you know, this particular person had some IgG and some IgM for the Borrelia piece, the different strains of Borrelia. So that's fine. So I haven't got here all the different pages that go with this, but this is the summary. You can see with the Babesia, there are a couple of markers. And if I go, I think I've got this is the Babesia one that follows on from that. So this person has, you know, a 13.3 at 12, so still very much in the indeterminate range, lower end of indeterminate. They also have an 18.8 on the Babesia duncani. So in this kind of situation, I think, okay, they've got a couple of different markers on Babesia microti. They've got a marker on Babesia duncani. That's 3 markers. So that's showing that their immune system is definitely having some kind of response here. Here's another one that's the same person, the same table with the Bartonella. So the Bartonella Hensley has the 13, just the moderate. They do have a 21.3 on the Bartonella Elizabethae. So looking at that, especially with the 21.3, I would say, yeah, Bartonella is a serious likelihood here. But what if they didn't have that Bartonella Elizabethae value on the bottom? What if it was just the 13 on the Bartonella Hensley and nothing else, if that was the only marker? Well, the next obvious thing is like, okay, so we've got to go back to the patient. Does that correlate? What are their symptoms? Does this make sense? But it's not crystal clear from the lab report. So in summary with Vibrant, so the pros are it tests for quite a lot of strains. It's a good option for SOT testing. Understand that's a small subset of the population that's going to be doing that. It's definitely lower cost. I mean, there's no question it's lower cost for the patient. And there is cases where doing a dried blood spot is really convenient rather than having to get a full blood draw. And patients can send in from abroad too, doing the dried blood spot. The PCR test cannot be done through the dried blood spot. But like I said, typically PCR is not finding the positives, so that's fine. The cons are, I do find the results to be ambiguous and open to interpretation. It considers moderate elevations as positives. And I would say at the time that we're doing this webinar, I've never seen an IgM positive on Borrelia. So going back to that panel I showed, and we'll look at a couple more, the panel of the Western blot for Borrelia, and the one that I showed you had like the 3 moderate or indeterminate, and then a positive IgG total result. I've never actually seen an IgM on the Lyme, on the Borrelia Western blot. I may see one tomorrow. I definitely have patients come to me, and if it's up to me, I suggest IGeneX testing and I tell them why, and it's basically the reasons I'm going to give you tonight. A lot of people come to me having Vibrant labs already run through other practitioners. And some of my patients, they just can't afford IGeneX, and so we do Vibrant. So I see quite a lot of them. So maybe there's a bunch more IgMs out there. I just haven't seen them yet. All right, so let's talk about IGeneX now. So in my opinion, and like I said, this is all my opinion, but I have a fair amount of experience to back it up. IGeneX is still the gold standard. It's quite reliable. It's more clarity in the results. It's for sure more expensive than Vibrant. There's no question about that. I really like that IGeneX has improved their testing over the years. So with the Borrelia testing, they used to offer the Western blot. Now they've advanced that to an immunoblot, which is a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more advanced, a little bit more sensitive. The immunoblots offer speciation, meaning if there's a positive result, they will try to break that down and find which strain of the pathogen triggered that positive result. So in other words, they may try and break down if it's Borrelia burgdorferi, is it the US strain? Is it a European strain? If it's Babesia, was it Babesia microti, Babesia duncani? they'll try and get more specific with it. Now, to be quite honest, clinically, that doesn't really make the biggest difference for me, right? It's nice to know, it's interesting information. I like that they're digging deeper. Clinically, does it change how I'm going to treat the patient? No, because really one strain of Babesia, in my view, is going to be treated much the same as the other. But it's nice information to have. The other thing IGeneX offers, so if on the immunoblot, you find yourself with a band 31 that's indeterminate, you can run a confirmation test to make sure that it was really Borrelia triggering that reading, triggering that indeterminate. Right, so that test is called a 31 kDa epitope, and they can run it either on IgG or IgM respectively. Those test numbers are for IgG and IgM. I used to do it more because I feel like I used to need more kind of lab data backup. I don't really run it so much anymore, but it's nice to know it's an option. So if you've got sort of an indeterminate or something that's negative, but you've got your suspicions, you can always get some follow-up testing. And they can run that on the same blood sample as well, which I'll talk about in a sec. Now, one of the huge things that I think gives so much more accuracy in the IGeneX testing these days is not only do they offer the immunoblot testing for the Borrelia, for Borrelia burgdorferi, I should say, they also offer it for tick-borne relapsing fever. Now, tick-borne relapsing fever is also Borrelia. They're just different strains. So if we consider that quote unquote Lyme disease, textbook definition of Lyme disease is infection with Borrelia burgdorferi, but there's a bunch of other Borrelias out there. So that sort of categorized borreliosis, but there are some strains of Borrelia that they group together and call that tick-borne relapsing fever. Okay, there's certain strains that fall under that category. So now they do immunoblot testing for tick-borne relapsing fever as well. And that's great because before they offered any testing for tick-borne relapsing fever, even just a standard antibody testing before the immunoblot came available, there would for sure be times where somebody tested negative on the Lyme front and maybe positive for co-infections. And what I found is once we started testing for tick-borne relapsing fever, somebody could test negative on Borrelia burgdorferi, but positive on tick-borne relapsing. So they've still got borreliosis. It just, we weren't finding it because we weren't looking for those strains, whereas now they are looking for those strains. They also offer immunoblot testing for Babesia and Bartonella, which is super great. So I think they started with the Bartonella about a year ago. Hence, kind of it fell off my knee to go to Galaxy Labs for Bartonella testing. And then a few months ago, I was like, oh, I wish they'd offer that for Babesia too. Wouldn't that be awesome? And then sure enough, it's only been in the last couple of months, but they now offer that for Babesia as well. And I love it. I've got a big theory. This is another whole topic, but I've got a big theory that misdiagnosed, undiagnosed co-infections and untreated co-infections are a big part of what hold our patients back. So I'm like obsessive about looking for co-infections. And I've developed this thing, and I probably will do a webinar about this because it's been so helpful that I would love to share this information. I've developed something called a co-infection provocation, where I use specific herbs at specific timing and in a specific way to like tease out in my patients which co-infections are plaguing them. And so I combine that information with the lab results and then kind of put the things together from there. So the IFA that used to be, the IFA was pooled antibodies, IgA, IgM, and IgG. It was a screening test. It was fine. I mean, I would look at it and go, okay, IFA positive. All right, fine. What else? Like, what does the Western blot say? It was an okay test. It was part of the panel, so we ran it. It was also recognized by the public health department because Lyme is reportable. So if somebody had positive Lyme by CDC criteria, it would get reported, and then the paperwork would always ask, do they have a positive IFA? And that was a test that they recognized in terms of looking at numbers of Lyme cases. So now that's being replaced by the Lyme screen immunoassay, IgG and IgM separately. So it's not a pooled antibody test anymore. That's all brand new. So sort of TBD how that's all going to play out and how much additional value that's going to add to the immunoblot. IGeneX has also come out with a culture-enhanced PCR test for all the major pathogens, so the Babesia, Bartonella, Borrelia, etc. Because it's a culture, it takes 1 month to turn around. There was a lab on the East Coast called Advanced Labs, and Dr. Joe Barascano, who he was in private practice when I started treating Lyme, and in my view was at that time the leading practitioner. And he got involved in research, and he got involved with this lab called Advanced Labs. Not entirely sure what happened to them, but not around anymore. And so the culture enhanced PCR test, it'll be interesting to see how much value that adds to the PCR, because what I said with the Vibrant panel, that I've never seen the PCR positive, that holds true for IGeneX too. And as I mentioned, I used to order the panels that had PCR testing, and then was sort of so disappointed with the lack of findings that I stopped ordering that and just really focused more on the antibody testing, and sometimes the FISH tests for Babesia and Bartonella, which FISH is a direct test as well, looking for direct evidence of the pathogen, but it's a smear test. They stain the sample, put it under a microscope, and look for the buggies to light up. So the culture enhanced PCR test is so new. I was on the phone to IGeneX a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, when's that coming out? And she said, oh, it's available now. Costing wise, it comes out for Lyme and co-infections. We were looking at it today. It's about equivocal with doing all the immunoblots, like the more indirect tests. So it's kind of cost prohibitive to do both. And so it'll be determined in the future as practitioners start running this test, whether it's going to be a more sensitive option, or how that's going to fit in. So I don't have that information yet. It's so brand new. So IGeneX also keeps blood samples on file for a couple of months in case any further tests need to be run. So if you got a result back and you were like, oh, maybe I want to do the band 31 confirmation test, or, I didn't run this particular co-infection, or I did, maybe I want to go back and do that. You can, and they keep the blood sample, which is nice for the patient, saves them having to get a drawer and sending it in and all of that. The PCR and the FISH test, so the two direct tests, cannot be run on existing samples. They have to be run on fresh samples, but antibody testing can be followed up on stored samples. IGeneX does offer a urine PCR test, as I mentioned, similar to the DNA Connections one. It's their tick-borne disease 7. I don't typically run it. I like the blood testing better. I certainly don't do both. So it's not something that I've really utilized, but I think when DNA Connections was so popular, IGeneX was probably like, oh, maybe we need to offer this as well. And they came in a couple of $100 cheaper than DNA Connections. I just don't really have much purpose for it because I do love their blood panels, and that's what I'm mostly doing. So recommendations for selecting the best panel: always test for co-infections. Like I said, undiagnosed, untreated co-infections are such a hindrance. And I'm finding more and more that my patients are like, the co-infections are almost worse than the Lyme itself. So I would recommend always testing for co-infections, not just like, let's go just see if your Lyme test is positive, and then if it is, we'll go on and do the co-infections, because sometimes you'll find more in the co-infections than you will in the Lyme itself. And you'll see that with a couple of my sample labs tonight. I would recommend choosing a panel. So again, some people have said to me, well, shouldn't we just test Lyme and Babesia and Bartonella if they're the 3 big ones that you're most concerned about? But by the time you patchwork all of that, you lose the sort of big panel discount. So it's not always cost effective. Often it's more cost effective just to do the panel and have everything bundled together. So as I've mentioned, PCR still doesn't find a lot of positives. So the lack thereof extra findings, to me, doesn't justify the increase in expense. So that is one place where we can save a little. I love that we have the immunoblot for Borrelia burgdorferi, tick-borne relapsing fever, Babesia and Bartonella. So I do incorporate panels or use panels that incorporate those. And then, yeah, it's lovely to get FISH tests for Babesia and Bartonella. I like the FISH tests, and I have found them valuable. I have found the FISH tests more valuable than the PCR. the fish is only for Babesia and Bartonella. But especially for Babesia, it can be helpful. And I'll show you again a panel in our samples tonight that where a patient had an elevated antibody to Babesia. And then we went back and tested her on the whole Babesia panel later, which was the fish, the PCR, everything. So I'll show you what came up in that report. So, you know, in a perfect world, my favorite panel would be what's called tick-borne disease panel 5. And now it's all very confusing. It's IBL-S. So the IBL means the immunoblot, S means the speciation. They're basically just indicating that that's their newer, updated panel, as opposed to their original tick-borne disease panel 5 that existed before these things came along. The current cost of that one is close to $2,000. So I recognize that that's a lot of money. For that, you're getting the Lyme screen immunoassay, IgM and IgG, the immunoblots for Borrelia burgdorferi, tick-borne relapsing fever, Babesia, and Bartonella, and I've listed the species there that they look for. IgM and IgG antibodies to HME and HGA, IgG only for 2 strains of rickettsia, which I see the HME, HGA rickettsia, I see much less commonly. And frankly, I worry about less, like I'm less concerned about finding it, because the truth is that pretty much whatever we do for the Lyme is going to be helpful for the Ehrlichias and the rickettsias. The Babesia and the Bartonella are the real standout problem children for me. And then the fish test for the Babesia and Bartonella is in this panel 5. My second favorite panel, but truthfully the one I order more than anything else, is currently called TBD4 IBL-S. Sorry, it says tick-borne disease panel 5. Don't listen, that's incorrect. TBD4. It's 1660, roughly 1660. Still a lot of money, I get, but so it's everything in the panel previously except not the fish test for Babesia and Bartonella. So it's the Lyme screen immunoassay, IgM and IgG, the immunoblots for the Borrelia, tick-borne relapsing, Babesia, Bartonella, and then it does have the antibodies for the Ehrlichias and the rickettsias. So this is the test that I run the most. So yeah, I mean, it's roughly $1,600, a little bit more. If people can't afford that. Now, look, I will say, and this is what I say to my patients, I'm going to tell you what I consider the best quality testing. This is the recommendations. Like I can't make recommendations based on worrying about whether they can pay for it or not, or want to pay for it or not, right? So as a healthcare practitioner, I'm like, this is what I think is best for you. And if they can't afford it and it's absolutely a hard no, then we find alternatives. What I have found is that many people, by the time they've been 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years not diagnosed, they've spent, $100,000 already. At this point, they want the best information they can get. And so I've even had people say, no, I want the Rolls-Royce panel. I want the PCR testing. I want the everything panel. Do the everything panel. And I'm like, okay. I say, and again, my recommendation, because what I've found is the everything panel, it's this much extra money and it sort of gives this, but it's not that. They're like, no, do it. I want to do that. So I have found a lot of people are like, they just want the answers, and Lyme disease testing is so tricky that we really, really need to really hone in and try and find the best data that we can find. There will be some people who can't afford it. So here are the options. If you have a Medicare patient, IGeneX does bill Medicare, which a lot of people don't realize, and it's like a huge opportunity for anyone who has Medicare. Testing must be ordered by an MD. That's actually incorrect. Testing must be ordered by a Medicare-approved practitioner. So for me as a naturopathic doctor in California, Medicare does not recognize my qualification. So I can't order the IGeneX for Medicare patients. I can order it, but it won't get covered by Medicare. So just be mindful of that. I have gone begging to people's primary care docs, asking them, would they please sign off on the testing? And I'm like, this is the panel I'm recommending. I will provide the kit. Here, we'll provide the form, and have them submit that to IGeneX and get that in, because it can save a lot of money. So you can run the ELISA and the Western blots through LabCorp or Quest or whatever and just see what they show. There are some people who come back positive. Some people get lucky and they're like, oh, we found it. But just remember, a negative result doesn't mean they don't have Lyme, right? There's lots of false negatives. You could conceivably run the basic Lyme panel without the tick-borne relapsing fever or co-infections. So with IGeneX, that would be the Lyme immunoblot panel 1. Like I said, you could potentially miss a lot of information that's clinically relevant there, but just as a starting point, it's not out of the question. Or run the TBD 1.0, the tick-borne panel through Vibrant as a screen, but just be prepared to wade through the results and do a lot of interpretation based on the person's clinical presentation. So let's talk a little bit about optimizing results now. How do we get the most out of Lyme testing in general? So firstly, don't give up if the ELISA is negative, right? The ELISA was not designed to be a diagnostic test. It was surveillance criteria. It was for like monitoring numbers of Lyme. It wasn't meant to be diagnostic in the first place. Run as many different types of tests as possible. So that's where in the panels, we might have an immunoblot. We might have the IFA, we might have a fish test. Like maximizing the different types of tests can be helpful. The immunoblot is the more advanced version of the Western blot. So if you have an immunoblot, that's going to be helpful. You can run both direct tests and indirect tests. So I have mentioned already that I like the fish slightly better than I like the PCR, but the fish is just for Babesia bartonella, not for Borrelia itself. And then, you know, an antibody test and immunoblot, just kind of looking at both things. And use a lab that's known for Lyme testing, right? So we don't go to LabCorp expecting really, really high quality specialized Lyme testing. We want to go to a lab that's really cognizant of the challenges and doing their darndest to make their testing good. Unless you really know your co-infections, run a co-infection panel in addition to a Lyme panel. That would be most helpful. And just bear in mind that if someone's on antibiotics or antimicrobials or whatnot, that may reduce the PCR accuracy. It shouldn't impact the Western blots or immunoblots or like any of the antibody testing. That was another thing that I remember being so challenging with DNA connections, is people had to be off antimicrobials for, I think it was a month that they were asking, which in the trajectory of a Lyme patient can make a huge difference in terms of how they're feeling. You can also look at immune markers like the CD57. You can look at general antibodies or general immune markers. Like, is somebody low? Do they have like a true immune deficiency where they're really low in antibodies? And therefore, you know that if they're not mounting good antibody responses, they're not going to be showing high antibody levels on lab testing. Remember that Lyme disease is a clinical diagnosis. So if the labs are negative, but the history and clinical presentation fit, then consider still treating the patient. You'll learn a lot about what's going on for them by how they respond to treatment. And that doesn't have to be antibiotic therapy if you're not a prescribing practitioner or you just don't want to go full tilt without lab work. And I would be that way too. I am that way too. Then start with natural antimicrobials and see how you progress, see how the patient progresses, see how the situation progresses. Like I said, you'll learn a lot based on how they respond to antimicrobial therapy. So in conclusion, there's no Lyme test that's 100% sensitive and specific. It's just, I wish there was, there's just not. Lyme disease is a clinical diagnosis backed up by lab work. And I do still consider IGeneX to be the gold standard in testing. But try as much as possible, make sure to test for co-infections as well, because that can really make a lot of difference in the outcome for your patient. All right, so I'm going to touch on this really quickly because this is an educational webinar, not a sales webinar, but I am going to let you know that my online course is Lyme Ed for practitioners. I know a few of our members in the Great Plains group have taken it. It's about 25 hours of teaching. It's like really everything I know about Lyme disease wrapped into this program. There's modules on testing, there's modules on natural treatments for Lyme, allopathic treatments for Lyme, the importance of detoxification. There's a whole module on hormone imbalance in Lyme, nutrition in Lyme, detoxification. Like, it's about 11, 12 modules. And so it's 25 25 hours of teaching. It's an online course. You get lifetime access. The cost is $497. In my view, it's great value. And if you wanted to find out more about that, the website's up here, https://www.programs.nicoladucharme.com. And you'll see the Lyme Ed for patients there as well, but the Lyme Ed for practitioners has extra stuff for you guys navigating, considering a Lyme-based practice. I also am part of the Lyme Academy. This is a 6-month mentorship and certification program. So you get all the didactic content of Lyme Ed, but we have weekly small group training calls with me every single week on education, case review, Q&A. It's the whole mentorship program. So if you wanted to learn about Lyme and sort of be guided and mentored, this is something to consider. We have a masterclass coming up on May 10th. It's going to be at 1:30 Pacific Standard Time. It's going to go like 3 to 4 hours. It's going to be a fairly intensive training. We've got a special price for you guys of $97. And you can find that at thelymeacademy.com/training. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, we have, Alexandra's asking, what natural antimicrobials work best for you? Oh my goodness. Alexandra, that is an entire webinar into itself. I would love to do that though, and talk about, I'd love to teach my co-infection provocation because it's in Lyme Ed, of course, but I could do a webinar on that for you guys. It's so helpful. And then we could talk more about herbs and antimicrobials and things like that. I don't really want to go off in that direction right now, just because I'm sensitive on time and I want to keep this focused on lab testing. But if any of you guys have requests or things that you want more information on, then feel free to just shoot me an email. My email is hello@drnicoladucharme.com. So by all means. Kate's asking, have I used a lab MDL diagnostics? And that's the one I was saying, they wouldn't, 10 years ago when I asked, they wouldn't give me an account. So I didn't end up using them. My impression of them was always quite good back in the day, but they've just been off my radar for so long that I can't really speak to them. My comment was, I think that they're probably used a little bit more by East Coast practitioners. And I've always been mentored here in California. So my mentors have always used IGeneX primarily. So I know that some other practitioners do use MDL. All right, so guys, hang in there. This is not the end. So I have finished the slideshow. What I'm going to do is stop sharing, but I do want to screen share with you some sample reports and just walk you through the interpretation. So if that would be helpful, hang around. This will be recorded. So if you can't stay all the way through, I will post the recording or get that somehow. But I just wanted to share, I just wanted to share that information at the end of the slideshow so that I can close that out. And then I'm going to try and screen share and look at some actual lab reports. And somebody actually asked, now here's where my techie gets a little bit compromised. Somebody actually asked if I could go over the actual IGeneX requisition. So let's see. So I want to go to preview. So what I'm trying to share here in my non-techie way is my actual desktop. So I think that worked. I'm just going to close out of this just so I don't have a lot of noise in the background, and I'll just minimize this over here. So hopefully you're seeing my actual desktop, not the neat and tidy version of one document, but that's just easy to flip back and forth between different reports. So yes. All right. Now, where do we want to start? Okay, let me pull up the IGeneX rec real quick, because I know this is kind of confusing for people. The first page, this is really just where the patient information goes. We always make sure our physician information is pre-filled, and then we just, so that it's just a quick process. And then the collections part down here is typically filled out by the drawing facility. So don't worry too much about that. So all of this stuff here is where it gets interesting. So remember, if I said you were just doing Lyme testing, not co-infections, that would be up here in the top left corner. The immunoblot panel 1. would give you that immunoassay screen and just the Lyme immunoblot, IgM and IgG. That's sort of your basic foundation. Further down here, if you can see my little cursor thingy moving, tick-borne disease for TBD for IBL with the S is the one I use the most. That's got all the good, immunoblots, etc. Tick-borne disease 5 is the one following. It's got the same plus the fish for Babesia and Bartonella. So if the extra, $350 doesn't break the bank for your patient, then it's nice to have. But the tick-borne disease 4 is the one I use most of all. All right, do we want Vibrant first or do we want IGeneX first, folks? Let's just look at a couple of Vibrants. Okay, so here's a situation where I feel like the Vibrant is like fairly clear. I'm just getting rid of this guy here. So you can see on this summary here, there's mostly IgG markers, which is what I see. There are some IgM markers, which is nice. I mean, IgM is indicative of active infection. Now, I will make the point that in chronic Lyme, okay, let me back up. If you looked at an immunology textbook, it would say that IgM is the first antibody on the scene and that IgG, like for the first few weeks, and then it would sort of pale out and then IgG would come in, right? In naturopathic medical school, they said M for Marines, send in the Marines first, and then G for ground forces come in later. In reality, what we see in chronic Lyme is that people can be IgG or IgM positive. Rarely both, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if it's IgM, it's a brand new infection, or that if it's, if it's IgG, it could be chronic, or it could just be long-term infection. Could it be a memory cell? It could. If somebody has been treated for Lyme or co-infections, they're still showing IgG positive, but they're in remission, then maybe it's just it's a memory cell. It's an ongoing marker. Lynette is asking, sorry, just interrupt myself, Q&A, will we be able to get copies of the slides? Good question, Lynette, and I can consider that. I can see how I could do that logistically, but yes, okay, I will take that suggestion on board. So here's one where we have a lot of Borrelia stuff and no co-infection stuff, right? So if we go down here, that's their summary page, blah, 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 blah. So on this one I'm pretty confident in, right? We've got 2 markers on that IgG column that are above 20. We've got a couple more that are in the moderate range. We've got a marker on the IgM that's above 20, a couple of others on the IgM in the moderate range. That to me is like, okay, I can see that's a positive result. I get it. That's fine. Okay, done. And it's really interesting to me because it's one of the very few panels I've seen. And then we've got other strains down here that are they're all represented in that summary table, but this just shows you a little bit more clearly. It's one of the very, very few panels I've ever seen that does not have anything positive in terms of co-infections. So I thought that was really interesting. So that's, I'll disappear these as we see them. Let's just do one more Vibrant, and then I do want to get to IGeneX. And we can always flip-flop back and forth. Okay, so here's one where I'm like, okay, what are we seeing here? So they did show positive, or they've got the IgG antibodies here, or the IgG markers, the IgM over here. So there are a couple of different Borrelia species that had some findings. So if we go, well, we'll go look at the Western blot for that. But look at the Babesia microti here. We have 1 marker for 1 strain of Babesia. The Bartonella here, we have 1 marker for 1 strain of Bartonella. Now, to be fair, their front page is the tick-borne summary. It doesn't say this is the positive findings, like this is not your positive lab result. It's a summary of the antibodies that came up, right? So then as we go down here and look in more detail, Here's the IgG, right? A bunch of moderates, one P28, which other labs wouldn't even look at, but that one's positive. So they came up with a positive result. So this is the Lyme stuff. But then look, if we get down to Babesia, okay? So here's Babesia microti, and there's one marker here. These are both negative. There's one screen here for Babesia duncani. So there's one IgG marker for Babesia microti, one marker on IgG that's in the moderate range. So what do you think? Do you think that person has Babesia? Is that a positive or is it not? So that's where I get a little lost. And most people come in thinking that what's on their summary is positive. They're positive on that. So this, I would very much default this back to the patient's presentation and their symptoms. And I would correlate that, which is fine for a practitioner that sort of knows those things. But not everybody does. Right. And the same here with Bartonella. Bartonella, we had a 16.5. So we had one IgG marker in the moderate range of the different strains of Bartonella that were tested. So what do we think? Is that a positive or not? We don't know, right? It's not enough information. And Vibrant doesn't even commit. Like they don't say if it's positive or negative. They just say, here's the antibody. It's what we consider the moderate range. So we really have to look at the presentation, the patient's presentation. Can you guys see these okay? Somebody just said they couldn't see it in this view. I know it's a bit busy because I've got a few different windows going on, but can you see these labs that can someone just pop it in the chat? I just want to make sure you're seeing what I'm looking at. Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Okay, so let's look at a couple of IGeneX panels. Hey, Nicole, I'm glad you're on. Okay, so let's go up to the top here. All right, so this one, this is the Immunoblot IgM. So you can say this is pretty recent. Immunoblot IgM. So this report says negative, right? So the first thing it's going to report is the IGeneX criteria, and then it's going to report the CDC criteria, just like Vibrant has their criteria and the CDC criteria. Patients always say, oh my God, I'm CDC positive. Am I so much sicker? Is this so much worse? It's like, no, you just happen to have the antibodies that the CDC or the bands on the Western blot that the CDC recognizes. It doesn't mean that your situation is that much more perilous. Lisa, I will come back to your question. That's a good one. I will come back to that for sure. So here I see indeterminate on 23, indeterminate on 31. Now on IGeneX, you need 2 of these 23, 31, 34, 39, 41. You need 2 positive to trigger a positive result. So these are 2 indeterminates. It's like I tell people, it's like a +1/2. It's not a +1, it's a +1/2. So with 2 indeterminates via IGeneX, it is not a positive result. It is a negative result. Now, when, knowing that those are fairly Lyme specific bands, I would look at that and go, okay, it's a bit suspicious. Let me move on and see what else I find. But at this point, I'd be like, okay, overall, that's reporting as negative. So I'd go, okay, let me see what else I find here. Because those 2, yeah, bit gray area, but they are indeterminate. So let's see. This here is just the speciation, right? So if your overall test result is negative, the speciation is going to be negative, right? So this is where they break it down, and this is the IgM speciation, which, as I mentioned, doesn't add like tons of clinical value for me, but they do it. This is the Lyme Immunoblot IgG. These also report as negative. So when I look at this one, look how clear this is, like not much going on, right? We have one band in the 41, and 41 is not a Lyme specific band. So when I see a positive 41, I take it with a grain of salt. If that's all there is, then I take it with a grain of salt. Viruses can trigger that, other things can trigger that. So that really is a pretty clear, the IgG is pretty clear. So then we go down, the speciation here is going to be negative. Then we get to the borreliosis, relapsing fever. So I'm looking at the IgM, and that's negative. So again, the speciation is going to be negative. But here we have a clear positive on the IgG for tick-borne relapsing fever. And the speciation tells us, halfway down the page, that it is Borrelia hermsii that triggered that positive result. To me, that's clear. The Borrelia burgdorferi with those two indeterminate bands, that was not clear. Okay, this is clear. So then we go, okay, tick-borne relapsing fever, we have borreliosis. Whether Borrelia burgdorferi is there or not at this point is moot because we have tick-borne relapsing fever and the treatments are going to be much the same. So then we look at babesiosis here. The immunoblot first, the IgM was negative, clear negative. Babesia immunoblot IgG was negative. Okay, so nothing on the Babesia. HME, there's an equivocal here on IgM. Like I said, that's kind of like secondary to me. The Borrelia, Babesia, Bartonella are the three Bs, the three biggies I look at. So Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, not much going on. There wasn't indeterminate here, which may have clinical significance, but I'm confident that that will get addressed in whatever treatment we pursue. Bartonellosis here, IgM negative, and then the IgG is indeterminate. So they will report sometimes as indeterminate if they didn't meet the full criteria on those immunoblots, these ones will sometimes report as indeterminate. So you will see that. So then again, you go back to the clinical presentation. Now this, I know who this is. This happens to be a little boy who's having a lot of neurological issues, a lot of anxiety, a lot of rage, a lot of attention problems. And so often in kids, we see Lyme presenting more neurological than sort of your classic joint pain and whatever. So it could be the borreliosis driving that. But I would be highly suspicious of Bartonella in him because of all those symptoms, the strong psych symptoms, and neurological involvement, right? So that's where we correlate it. So in this kiddo, I would say we have a positive Lyme. And when I say Lyme, I'm talking about like the bigger umbrella of borreliosis and a high suspicion of Bartonella. So now let's look at, let's look at this one. Okay. So let's see. I put the initials so I would still know the patient because it's like helpful. Like it's always got to be in context, right? So, okay, IgM immunoblot, this first page here. So we have a positive band 23, and I'm like, Lyme specific band. We have an indeterminate band 34. Lyme specific band. But it's an indeterminate. So if we're calling an indeterminate like a +1/2, then this result is like a 1.5. And we need a 2 to give it a positive, to trigger a positive. So it doesn't meet the criteria. Okay, fine. So again, we take that and we say, okay, let's move along and we see what else we find. Well, here we've got the IgG immunoblot positive. So it's IGeneX criteria, not CDC, but that's what you're going to see the majority of the time. It's quite unusual to get CDC positive because they're so fussy. But IGeneX wise, it met the criteria. They've got a positive 39 and a positive 41. Okay. You can see over here, they've got a positive 18. But if you look at the criteria, band 18 is not, it doesn't count. It's not one of the ones they consider. So your hint is the bands that are important have the asterisk. And it's written clearly here on every page. So this one here meets the IGeneX criteria, but does not meet the CDC criteria, which is fine. IGeneX criteria is all we care about. We don't care about the CDC. Okay, I didn't say that. All right, babesiosis here, IgM was negative. IgG was negative. So, okay, moving on. Bartonella, IgM was negative, but IgG was positive. right? So this is a clear positive with Bartonella, which also does fit. This is a teenage girl who's just getting sicker and sicker and can't even go to school, and all the terrible things. So for her, she wasn't really showing any symptoms of babesia. And again, on another day, I can do and offer another webinar. I love teaching about Lyme and stuff that I feel confident about. So I really enjoy doing these things. But that would be, yeah, also another conversation for another whole day. Lisa's asking, why are they checking for bands that don't count or are not specific? Look, the 41, it's not Lyme specific, but it's part of the picture. Okay, why they have the bands listed here that aren't starred, I couldn't really tell you. But what's interesting to note is there are some bands here, and I mentioned this earlier, there are some bands like the 30 here or the 28 that IGeneX doesn't consider relevant that Vibrant does and will count towards their diagnosis. So there are differences between the two labs in terms of the bands that they even consider important. So in this teenage girl, clear Lyme, clear Bartonella, fits with the clinical picture. So yeah, that one was fairly straightforward. So the last one I want to show you is, okay, so this is my patient here. Sorry, I was teaching my mentor group today and looking at some of these labs. All right, so this one was done, May of last year. So this original IGeneX was a little bit older. Patient came to me for treatment of Candida, saying, I think I have a Candida issue and I know that I have viral issues, Epstein-Barr. And so this is another thing I see just as a sort of clinical pearl. Like, a lot of people come to me having done 2 or 3 years of Candida treatment or 2 or 3 years of antiviral treatment, because those things might be present for them, but they weren't the primary issue. Like, where Lyme and co-infections were always the primary sort of underlying cause, but maybe they were with a practitioner that didn't have that knowledge, that was confident treating Epstein-Barr, or confident treating Candida, or maybe confident treating mycotoxins. And I say that with the greatest respect and reverence of this group, because I know a lot of you are out there doing amazing work with mycotoxins. The tricky part is there's so much overlap between mold toxicity and Lyme that now I try and test all my patients for mycotoxins, just because, in the last 5 years, it's really come on my radar a lot more as a Lyme practitioner, how I really do need to get up to speed with the mycotoxin stuff. And that say, I would encourage you the same the other way around. All right, so this is the IFA was still around. So we have a clear positive on the IFA. So as I said, with the IFA, I'm like, yes, that's interesting. It's a screen. Yes, what else do I find? So then I scroll down, and I'm like, oh, right. Okay. So here's one of the rare cases. This was CDC positive. And like I said, that doesn't bode any worse for the patient. It's just strictly that she happened to have the 23, 39, or 41, which are the bands that the CDC considers, whereas IGeneX looks at the 31 and the 34 as well. So this is clear cut. So right away, we're like, okay, positive IFA, positive IgM Western blot, boom, done. So then what else have we got? And the speciation showed it was more European, as opposed to the US kind of species here. By the way, the European versus US species really doesn't correlate with where the patient got bit or where they were infected. Like, this was a patient who lives in New Jersey. It's not like she got bitten in Europe. So there are European strains here in the US. So then her IgG immunoblot was negative. Okay, so remember I said we typically either see IgM or IgG, not both. So you can see she doesn't have a lot going on in the IgG, but her IgM was clear as day. So then we go further for her into tick-borne relapsing fever, and sure enough, she's positive IgG for tick-borne relapsing fever. So positive IFA, positive IgM Western blot or immunoblot, and positive tick-borne relapsing fever. So this lady has a lot going on. There's more you'll see. And her her level of functioning and well-being reflects it. She's super duper sick. She's getting better. So Babesia, so look at this. So Babesia, this is back when they did the IFA, not the immunoblot, right? So Babesia microti, IgM negative, IgG negative, IgM negative for Duncani, but her Babesia Duncani was 160 on the IgG, which is high. And for this particular lady, I always was convinced that Babesia was like one of her biggest things. She had a lot of anxiety, a lot of dizziness, a lot of shortness of breath, chest pressure, air hunger. I mean, it was just classic Babesia, but I'll tell you the story, what happened. So Ehrlichia was negative, fine, boring. So Bartonella for her was indeterminate on the IgM and positive on the IgG. And then she does have some indeterminates on the rickettsia. So lots of co-infections going on. So what ended up happening with this lady, so she's in New Jersey, so I can't prescribe for her. So she goes to a Lyme literate doctor in New Jersey who proceeded to treat her for Lyme and Bartonella. And to be fair, Lyme and Bartonella is what they had the most evidence of on lab work, right? However, I mean, and this was just a hunch, and it's just, I'm not saying I'm right in every single case, but I knew that Babesia was getting her. I knew it. I just knew it. But I didn't have the power to control what this other doctor was doing. And so she was treating my patient for Lyme and Bartonella. And like a couple of things got a little bit better. And she did have some, Herx reactions. And she was on IV antibiotics for a while. She was on rifampin. She was on all the things. And I was supporting her naturopathically and whispering in her ear, we need to treat Babesia. We need to treat Babesia. So she went with that treatment for a while, and then she wasn't really getting better, and she was just feeling crappy from the medications. And she's like, oh, what can I do? And I said, well, let's run a Babesia panel. Like we had that IgG, elevation. Now she's done some other antibiotics for other pathogens, right? And sometimes we find that start killing off one, something else gets stirred up. It's kind of like that whack-a-mole game. So I said, okay, let's get a Babesia panel. So check this out. So then we do a Babesia panel. And this was February of this year. So this is several months later and quite a lot of other antibiotics later. And there it is, clear as day. So the FISH test is positive. The PCR is negative, which really goes in line with what I said earlier. PCRs rarely show up positive, but the FISH sometimes does. I like the FISH. So we had a direct test that was positive for Babesia. And then now the immunoblot IgM was positive. So why is it positive now and it wasn't before? Maybe because the immunoblot is more sensitive. Maybe it's because she's done some other treatment and so her immune system is reacting differently. And then the IgG, in this case, was negative. But with a positive FISH and a positive IgM, to me, that's clear as day. So she takes this test back to her doctor and said, I want to be treated for Babesia. And the doctor refused. And so in frustration, my patient then goes to see another Lyme literate doc in New York. And that doctor was willing to prescribe a very low dose of Malarone, which is a Babesia medication. And this is all fairly recently, by the way, in the last month or so. And so my patient now, who is still taking a very low dose of rifampin, is still taking a low dose of minocycline, because rifampin did help one symptom. And we didn't want to rock the boat by pulling those, but she started the Malarone for Babesia and literally within 2 or 3 days was feeling a lot better. And it's only been like 2 or 3 weeks. And this is someone who, I mean, was very, very down, very depressed, very anxious, like it was in the negative spiral. And within a few weeks, she's seeing improvement. Within days, she saw improvement. And so, the dizziness, the off balance feeling, all, the things are still there, but she's having more good days. She's walking like several miles a day. She can go out of the house and have conversations with people without getting all like neurologically messed up. It's really been quite something. But it was that, follow-up babesiosis test. Now, had it been me and I'd been prescribing for her, I would have just treated based on her clinical picture. But, sometimes when we follow up with more detailed testing, we do get more answers, and that helps. Theoretically, it helps to guide the treatment, so long as you have a practitioner that's willing to look at the results and be like, oh yeah, that's right, it is positive. So so with that, let me stop sharing my screen and then just check for chats or questions or whatever that we haven't addressed. Yes, Deepa, this was recording from the beginning. Let me hope. Yes, it is recording. It's my biggest fear, right, is doing something like this and have it not be recorded, and then people get mad at you after. So Lisa's asking, yeah, good question. What if positive IgM is seen even after treatment? I very much default that to how the patient's doing. Like and the bottom line is this, I do feel that a positive IgM indicates active infection. So I feel like if the IgM is still positive, there is probably still active infection that needs to be dealt with. Like that's kind of the shortcut answer. I know there's so many things with Lyme aren't super black and white, but that's kind of how I see it. All right, so I think I've addressed all the questions in the Q&A. Let me just check for the chat. I think I have addressed everything there as well. Super. All right. Great. And we made it within 90 minutes. That was my goal. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. And thank you so much for joining, and thank you for staying till the end. Oh, one more question. Deepa's asking, on average, how long do you need to treat before they go off treatment? Oh, it's usually months, to be honest. It's usually months. It can even be a year or even more. Lyme treatment is long and arduous. It's not, I tell people, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I typically want to treat for 2 months beyond resolution of symptoms. I will say that. So we don't want to stop treatment too early. And if I do have someone treating on antibiotics, I will always be doing naturopathic support along the way and herbal antimicrobials, but I also make sure to keep herbal antimicrobials on even beyond medications. What's the longest it took from your experience? There are people I know who are on and off treatment for years. I'll be quite honest with you. I have a patient that he sort of pops up on my radar every couple of years, and it's like, oh, I was doing really well, but now I just feel like I'm having a flare, I'm struggling. And so we sort of go down, do a little bit more treatment, get him back on track. But yeah, I mean, I've treated people for a couple of years, definitely. All right, everyone. So wonderful to be with you. Thank you again. And if you're watching on the replay, thank you for joining after the fact. And yeah, you're so welcome. Nice to see you, Brad. I haven't seen you in forever. So, and Nicole, thank you for joining. A couple of familiar faces here. All right, so enjoy the rest of your evening or the rest of your day, wherever you are, and I will see you again soon.